The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. A Night on the Mountain, page 684. Me and Grandpa thought Indian. Later, people would tell me that this is naive, but I knew and I remembered what Grandpa said about words. If it is naive, it does not matter, for it is also good. Grandpa said it would always carry me through, which it has. Like the time the big city men made a trip to our mountains. Grandpa was half Scot, but he thought Indian. Such seemed to be the case with others, like the great Red Eagle, Bill Weatherford, or Emperor McGillivray, or McIntosh. They gave themselves, as the Indian did, to nature, not trying to subdue it or pervert it, but to live with it. And so they loved the thought, and loving it grew to be it, so that they could not think as the white man. Grandpa told me, the Indian brought something to trade and laid it at the white man's feet. If he saw nothing he wanted, he picked up his wares and walked off. The white man, not understanding, called him an Indian giver, meaning one who gives and then takes back. This is not so. If the Indian gives a gift, he will make no ceremony of it, but will simply leave it to be found. Grandpa said the Indian held his palm up to show peace, that he held no weapon. This was logical to Grandpa, but seemed funny as hell to everybody else. Grandpa said the white man meant the same thing by shaking hands, except his words were so crooked he had to try to shake a weapon out of the sleeve of the feller who claimed he was a friend. Grandpa was not given much to handshaking, as he said he didn't like for a man to try to shake something out of his sleeve after he had presented himself as a friend. It was total distrustful of a man's word, which is reasonable. As to folks saying how, and then laughing when they see an Indian, Grandpa said it all come about over a couple of 100 years. He said every time the Indian met a white man, the white man commenced to ask him, how are you feeling? Or how are you people? Or how are you getting along? Or how is the game where you come from? And so on. He said the Indian come to believe that the white man's favorite subject was how. And so, being polite, when he met the white man, he figured he would just say how, and then let the son of a bitch talk about whichever how he wanted to. Grandpa said people laughing at that was laughing at an Indian who was trying to be courteous and considerate. We had delivered our wares to the Crossroads store, and Mr. Jenkins said 2 big city men had been there. He said they was from Chattanooga and drove a long black automobile. Mr. Jenkins said they wanted to talk to Grandpa. Grandpa looked at Mr. Jenkins from under his big hat. Tax law? No, Mr. Jenkins said, they wasn't law at all. Said they was in the whiskey trade. Said they heard tell you was a good maker and they wanted to put you in a big still and that you could get rich working for 'em. Grandpa didn't say anything. He bought some coffee and sugar for Grandma. I picked up the wood chips and taken the old candy off Mr. Jenkins' hands. Mr. Jenkins fidgeted around to hear what Grandpa had to say about it, but he knew Grandpa too well to ask. They said they would be back, Mr. Jenkins said. Grandpa bought some cheese, which I was glad, as I liked cheese. We walked out and didn't hang around the store, but headed straight off up the trail. Grandpa walked fast. I hadn't time to pick berries and had to do away with the old candy while I was in a continual trot behind Grandpa. When we got to the cabin, Grandpa told Grandma about the big city men. He said, you stay here, little tree. I'm going to the still and lay some more cover and branches over it. If they come, you let me know. He taken off up the holler. I sat on the front porch watching for big city men. Grandpa had not hardly gone from sight when I saw them and told Grandma. Grandma stayed back, standing in the dog trot, and we watched them coming up the trail and across the footlog. They had fine clothes like politicians. The big fat man wore a lavender suit and a white tie. Skinny man had on a white suit and a black shirt which shined. They wore big city hats made of fine straw. They walked right up to the porch, though they didn't mount the steps. The big man was sweating pretty bad. He looked at Grandma. "We want to see the old man," he said. "I figured he was sick, for his breathing was bad, and it was hard to see his eyes. His eyes looked slitted, way back in swelled up fat." Grandma didn't say nothing. I didn't either. The big man turned around to the skinny man. "The old squaw don't understand English, Slick." Mr. Slick was looking around over his shoulder, though I didn't see anything behind him. He had a high voice. "Screw the old squaw," he said. "I don't like this place, Chunk. Too far back in the mountains. Let's get out of here." Mr. Slick had a little mustache. "Shut up," Mr. Chunk said. Mr. Chunk pushed his hat back. He didn't have any hair. He looked at me sitting in the chair. "The boy looks like a breed," he said. "Maybe he understands English." "Do you understand English, boy?" I said, "I reckon." Mr. Chunk looked at Mr. Slick. "Hear that? He reckons." They got tickled about this and laughed right loud about it. I saw Grandma move back and turn Blue Boy out. He headed up the holler for Grandpa. Mr. Chunk said, "Where's your pa, boy?" I told him I didn't recollect my pa, that I live here with Grandpa and Grandma. Mr. Chunk wanted to know where Grandpa was, and I pointed back up the trail. He reached in his pocket and took out a whole $1 and held it out toward me. "You can have this $1, boy, if you take us to your grandpa." He had big rings on his fingers. I seen right off that he was rich and more than likely could afford the $1. I taken it and put it in my pocket. I knew figures pretty well. Even splitting with Grandpa, I'd get back the 50 cents which had been slickered out of by the Christian. I felt pretty good about the whole thing, leading them up the trail. But as we walked, I commenced to think I couldn't take them to the still. I led them up the high trail. As we walked up the high trail, I felt kind of bad about it, and I didn't have any idea in the world what I was going to do. Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick, however, was in fine spirits. They pulled off their coats and walked along behind me. Each one had a pistol in his belt. Mr. Slick said, "Don't remember your pa, huh, kid?" I stopped and said I hadn't no recollection of him at all. Mr. Slick said, "That would make you a bastard, wouldn't it, kid?" I said I reckoned, though I had not got to the B's in the dictionary and had not studied that word. They both laughed until they commenced coughing. I laughed too. They seemed like happy fellers. Mr. Chunk said, "Hell, they're all a bunch of animals." I said we had lots of animals in the mountains, wild cats and wild hogs, and me and Grandpa had seen a black bear once. Mr. Slick wanted to know if we had seen one lately. I said we hadn't, but we had seen signs. I pointed to a poplar tree where a bear had taken a claw swipe. "There's a sign right there," I said. Mr. Chunk jumped sideways like a snake had struck at him. He bumped into Mr. Slick and knocked him down. Mr. Slick got mad. "Damn you, Chunk, you nearly knocked me off the trail. If you had knocked me down there..." Mr. Slick pointed down into the holler. Him and Mr. Chunk both leaned over and looked down. You could barely see the spring branch far below us. "Good gosh," Mr. Chunk said, "how high are we? Hell, if you slipped off this trail, you'd break your neck." I told Mr. Chunk I didn't know how high we was, but I reckon it was pretty high, though I had never give it any thought. The higher we got, the more Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick coughed. They also fell further and further behind me. Once I come back down the trail looking for them, and they were sprawled out under a white oak. The white oak had poison ivy all around its roots, and they was laying in the middle of it. Poison ivy is purty and green, but you had better not lay in it. It will pop welts out all over you and make sores that will last for months. I didn't say nothing about the poison ivy. They was already in it anyway, and I didn't want to make them feel worse about things. They's looking pretty bad. Mr. Slick raised his head up. Listen, you little bastard, he said, how much further we got to go? Mr. Chunk didn't raise his head. He laid there in the poison ivy with his eyes closed. I said we was nearly there. I had been thinking. I knew that Grandma would send Grandpa up the high trail after me, so when we got to the top of the mountain, I was going to tell Mr. Slick and Mr. Chunk that we would just sit down and wait, that Grandpa would be along directly, which he would. I figured it would work out all right and I could keep the $1, seeing as how I would have more or less taken him to Grandpa. I set off up the trail. Mr. Slick helped Mr. Chunk out of the poison ivy patch, and they kind of staggered along behind me. They left their coats in the patch. Mr. Chunk said they'd get the coats on the way back. I got to the top of the mountain a long time before they did. The high trail was part of a lot of trails, old Cherokee trails that ran along the rim of the mountain, but forked going down the mountain on the other side, and forked 4 or 5 times on the way down. Grandpa said the trails led maybe 100 miles back into the mountains. I sat down under a bush where the trail made a fork, one branch running the top of the mountain, the other dipping over the mountain down the other side. I figured I would wait on Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick, and we would all sit here till Grandpa come. It took them a long time. When they finally come over the top of the mountain, Mr. Chunk had his arm over Mr. Slick's shoulders. He had hurt his foot, more than likely, for he was limping and hopping pretty bad. Mr. Chunk was saying that Mr. Slick was a bastard, which surprised me, as Mr. Slick had not said anything about being a bastard too. Mr. Chunk was saying that Mr. Slick was the one who originally thought up the idea of putting Mountain Hicks to work for him. Mr. Slick said it was Mr. Chunk's idea to put this damn Indian, and that Mr. Chunk was a son of a bitch. They was talking so loud they passed right by me. I didn't have a chance to tell him we had ought to wait, as Grandpa had learnt me not to interrupt when people was talking. They went on down the trail on the other side of the mountain. I watched them until they disappeared amongst the trees, heading into a deep cleft between the mountains. I figured I'd better wait on Grandpa. I didn't have to wait long. Blue Boy showed up first. I saw him sniffing my trail, and he come up tail wagging. In a minute I heard a whippoorwill. It sounded exactly like a whippoorwill, but as it was not dark yet, I knew it was Grandpa. I whippoorwilled back, might near as good. I saw his shadow slipping through the trees in the late evening sun. He wasn't following the trail, and you could never hear him if he didn't want to be heard. In a minute, there he was. I was glad to see him. I told Grandpa that Mr. Slick and Mr. Chunk had gone on down the trail, and also everything I could remember they said while we was walking. Grandpa grunted and didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed down. Grandma had sent us victuals in a sack, and me and Grandpa sat down under a cedar tree and ate. Corn pone and catfish cooked in meal taste good in the air of a high mountain. We finished off all of it. I showed Grandpa the $1, which I reckoned if Mr. Chunk figured I had done my job, I could keep. I told Grandpa as soon as we got some change, we could split it. Grandpa said I had done my job, as he was here to see Mr. Chunk. Grandpa said I could keep the whole $1. I told Grandpa about the green and red box at Mr. Jenkins' store. I said I figured more than likely it wasn't much over $1. Grandpa said he figured that too. Far off we heard a yell down in the cleft of the mountain. We had plumb forgot about Mr. Chunk and Slick. It was getting dark. Whippoorwills and chipwills had started singing on the side of the mountain. Grandpa stood up and cupped his hands around his mouth. Woo-hee! Grandpa hollered down the mountain. The sound bounced off another mountain as plain as if Grandpa had been over there. Then it bounced into the cleft and on up the hollers, getting weaker and weaker. There wasn't any way of figuring where the sound had come from. The echoes had barely died away when we heard 3 gunshots from down in the cleft. The sound bounced around and traveled off. Pistols, Grandpa said. They're answering with pistol fire. Grandpa cut loose again. Hoo-wee! I did too, which both of us hollering made the echoes jump and bounce even more. Pistol went off again 3 times. Me and Grandpa kept a-hollering. It was fun listening to the echoes. Each time the pistol answered us until it didn't answer the last time. They're out of bullets, Grandpa said. It was dark now. Grandpa stretched and yawned. No need me and ye thrashing around down there tonight, little tree, trying to get 'em out. They'll be all right. We'll get 'em tomorrow. Which suited me. Me and Grandpa pulled spring boughs under the cedar tree to sleep on. If you're going to sleep out in the mountains during spring and summer, you had better sleep on spring boughs. If you don't, red bugs will eat you up. Red bugs are so little you can't hardly see them with the naked eye. They are all over leaves and bushes by the millions. They will crawl on you and bury you up in your skin, causing rashes and bumps to break out all over you. Some years they are worse than others. This was a bad red bug year. There are also wood ticks. Me and Grandpa and Blue Boy crawled up on the spring boughs. Blue Boy curled up by me and felt warm in the sharp air. The boughs were soft and springy. I commenced yawning. Me and Grandpa clasped our hands behind our heads and watched the moon come up. It is full and yellow, slipping over a far mountain. We could see might near 100 miles. Grandpa said, mountains humping and dipping in the moon spray, making shadows and deep purples in their hollows. Fog drifted along in threads far below us, moving through the hollows, snaking around the sides of the mountains. One little patch of fog would come around the end of a mountain like a silver boat and bump into another one, and they would melt together, take off up a holler. Grandpa said the fog looked alive, which it did. A mockingbird set up song right near us in a high elm. Far back in the mountains, we heard 2 wildcats mating. They sounded like they were screaming mad, but Grandpa said mating feels so good that cats can't help but scream about it. I told Grandpa I would might near like to sleep on a mountaintop every night. He said he would too. A screech owl screeched down below us, and then there was yells and screams. Grandpa said it was Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick. He said if they didn't settle down, they'd disturb practically all the birds and animals on the mountainside. I went to sleep looking at the moon. Me and Grandpa woke at dawn. There's not anything like dawn from the top of the high mountain. Me and Grandpa and Blue Boy too watched it. The sky was light gray, and the birds getting up for the new day made fuss and twitters in the trees. Way across 100 miles, the mountaintops humped like islands in the fog that floated below us. Grandpa pointed to the east and said, "Watch." Above the rim of the farthest mountain on the end of the world, a pink streak whipped across. A paintbrush swept 1,000,000 miles across the sky. Morning wind picked up and hit our faces, and me and Grandpa knew the colors and the morning birth had come alive. The paintbrush run up in streaks, red, yellow, and blue. The mountain rim looked like it had caught fire. Then the sun cleared the trees. It turned the fog into a pink ocean, heaving and moving down below. The sun hit me and Grandpa in the face. The world had got born all over again. Grandpa said it had, and he'd taken off his hat, and we watched it for a long time. Me and Grandpa had a feeling, and I knew right off that we would come again to the mountaintop and watch the morning come. The sun cleared the mountain and floated free in the sky, and Grandpa sighed and stretched. "Well," he said, "ye and me have got work to do. Tell you what," Grandpa scratched his head. "Tell you what," he said again. "You trot down to the cabin and tell Grandma we'll be up here a while. Tell her to fix ye and me something to eat and put it in a paper sack, and fix them 2 big city fellers something to eat and put it in a tow sack. Can you remember now, paper sack and tow sack?" I said I could. I started off. Grandpa stopped me. "And Little Tree," he said, and commenced grinning about something. "Before Grandma fixes the two fellers something to eat, you tell everything you can recollect that the two fellers said to ye." I said I would and set off down the trail. Blue Boy went with me. I heard Grandpa commence to call up Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick. Grandpa was yelling, "Hoo-wee!" I would have liked to stayed and hollered too, but I didn't mind running down the trail, especially early in the morning. This was the time of morning when all the creatures was coming out for the day living. I saw two coons high in a walnut tree. They peeped down at me and talked as I passed under them. Squirrels chattered and leaped across the trail. They set up and fussed at me as I walked by. Birds dipped and fluttered all along the trail, and a mockingbird followed me and Blue Boy a long way, dipping down at my head, teasing. Mockingbirds will do this if they know you like 'em, which I do. When I got to the cabin clearing, Grandma was sitting on the back porch. She knew I was coming, I figured, by watching the birds, though I suspicioned that Grandma could smell anybody coming, for she was never surprised. I told her Grandpa wanted something to eat in a paper sack for me and him, and for Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick something to be put in a tow sack. Grandma commenced to cook up the victuals. She had fixed mine and Grandpa's and was frying fish for Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick when I recollected to tell her what they had said. While I was telling her, of a sudden she pulled the frying pan off the fire and got out a pot which she filled with water. She dropped Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick's fish in the pot. I reckon she had decided to boil their fish instead of frying, but I had never seen her use the root powders in cooking that she put in the pot. Their fish got a good boiling. I told Grandma Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick appeared to be good-spirited fellers. I told her that I originally thought we was all laughing because I was a bastard, but it turned out what they was more than likely laughing at was Mr. Slick's being one too, as I had heard Mr. Chunk remind him. Grandpa put some more root powders in the pot. I told her about the $1 that Grandpa said I had done my job and could keep. Grandma said I could keep it too. She put the $1 in my fruit jar for me, but I didn't tell her about the red and green box. There was not any Christians about, as I knew of, but I wasn't going to take no chances. Grandma boiled the fish until the steam got heavy. Her eyes was watering down over her face, and she was blowing her nose. She said she reckoned it was the steam. Grandma put the fish for the big silly fellers in the tow sack, and I set off up the high trail. Grandma turned all the hounds out, and they went with me. When I got to the top of the mountain, I didn't see Grandpa. I whistled, and he answered from halfway down the other side. I went down the trail. It was narrow and shaded over with trees. Grandpa said he had practical called up Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick out of the cleft. He said they was answering him pretty regular and ought to be coming in sight pretty soon. Grandpa had taken their sack of fish and hung it down from a tree limb right over the trail where they couldn't miss it. Me and Grandpa moved back up the trail a ways and sat down under persimmon bushes to eat our dinner. The sun was mighty near straight up. Grandpa made the dogs lay down, and we ate on our corn pone and fish. Grandpa said it had taken him some time to get Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick to understand in which direction they was to take toward his voice, but they was finally coming. Then we saw 'em. If I had not known them right well, I couldn't have recollected as ever having seen 'em before. Their shirts was tore up complete. They had big cuts and scratches over their arms and faces. Grandpa said it looked like they had run through briar patches. Grandpa said he couldn't figure how they got all the big red lumps on their faces. I didn't say nothing, as it was none of my business, but I figured it was from laying in the poison ivy vines. Mr. Chunk had lost a shoe. They come up the trail slow and heads down. When they saw the tow sack hanging over the trail, they taken it loose from the tree limb and sat down. They ate all of Grandma's fish and argued pretty regular over which was getting the most of it. We could hear 'em then plain. After they finished eating, they stretched out on the trail in the shade. I figured Grandpa would go down and get him up, but he didn't. We just sat and watched. After a while, Grandpa said it was better to let them rest a while. They didn't rest long. Mr. Chunk jumped up. He was bent over and holding his stomach. He ran into the bushes at the side of the trail, pulled his britches down. He squatted and commenced to yell, "Oh, shit, my insides is coming out." Mr. Slick done the same thing. He yelled too. They groaned and hollered and rolled on the ground. In a little while, both of them crawled out of the bushes and laid down on the trail. They didn't lay down long, but jumped up and done it all over again. They taken on so loud that the dogs got excited, and Grandpa had to quieten them. I told Grandpa it appeared to me that they was squatting in a poison ivy patch. Grandpa said it looked like they was. Also, I told Grandpa they was wiping themselves with poison ivy leaves. Grandpa said more than likely they was. One time Mr. Slick run from the trail back into the poison ivy patch, but did not get his britches down in time. He commenced to have some trouble after that with flies buzzing over him. This went on for mighty near an hour. After that, they laid flat out in the trail, resting up. Grandpa said more than likely it was something they had ate, which didn't agree with them. Grandpa stepped out in the trail and whistled down to him. Both the men got on their hands and knees and looked up toward me and Grandpa. Leastwise, I think they looked at us, but their eyes were swelled mighty near shut. Both of them yelled. "Wait a minute," Mr. Chunk hollered. Mr. Slick kind of screamed, "Hold on, man, for God's sake." They got to their feet and scrambled up the trail. Me and Grandpa went on up the trail to the top of the mountain. When we looked back, they was limping behind us. Grandpa said we might as well go back down the trail to the cabin, as they could now find their way out and would be along directly. So we did. It was late sun by the time me and Grandpa got to the cabin. We sat on the back porch with Grandma and waited for Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick to come along. It was about 2 hours later and dusk dark when they made it to the clearing. Mr. Chunk had lost his other shoe and appeared to tiptoe along. They made a wide circle around the cabin, which surprised me, as I figured they wanted to see Grandpa, but they changed their mind. I asked Grandpa about keeping my dollar. He said I could, as I had done my part of the job. It wasn't my fault they changed their minds, which is reasonable. I followed them around the cabin. They crossed the footlog, and I hollered and waved to him. "Goodbye, Mr. Chunk. Goodbye, Mr. Slick. I thank you for the dollar, Mr. Chunk." Mr. Chunk turned and peered to shake his fist at me. He fell off the footlog into the spring branch. He grabbed at Mr. Slick and nearly pulled him off, but Mr. Slick kept his balance and made it across. Mr. Slick reminded Mr. Chunk that he was a son of a bitch, and Mr. Chunk, as he crawled out of the spring branch, said that when he got back to Chattanooga, if he ever did, he's going to kill Mr. Slick. Though I don't know why they had fell out with one another. They passed out of sight down the holler trail. Grandma wanted to send the dogs after him, but Grandpa said no. He said he figured they was total wore out. Grandpa said he reckoned it all come about from a misunderstanding on Mr. Chunk and Mr. Slick's part regarding me and Grandpa working for him in the whiskey trade. I figured more than likely it was too. It had all taken up the best part of 2 days of mine, in Grandpa's time. I had, however, come out $1 ahead. I cautioned Grandpa that I was still willing and stood ready to split the dollar with him as we was partners, but he said no. I had earned $1 without any connection in the whiskey trade. Grandpa said all things considered, it was not bad pay for the work, which it wasn't. End of chapter.